Hi, I'm Harnoor, and welcome to the Read to Heal podcast.
I'm Madi.
I'm Emdya.
Today we'll be discussing The Real Mother of the Civil Rights Movement by Sohaila Ammar, which is currently available in Novelty's digital library. This essay discusses Claudette Colvin, a young woman who started the bus boycotts before Rosa Parks during the 1960s Civil Rights Movement. Unfortunately, we don't have the author here with us today, but we'd love to introduce her anyways. Sohaila was a 17-year-old senior living in Massachusetts during the time this piece was written. She enjoys researching topics that involve things she cares about, including social justice. She also enjoys politics and debating, as well as swimming, skateboarding, and thrifting. I'd like to start us off with an excerpt from the essay. And so just to preface this a little bit, I think most of us would mistake Rosa Parks as the first woman to ever start the revolutionary act of starting a bus boycott, when in actuality Miss Colvin was the first person to challenge the law. When asked about her feelings towards Rosa Parks being the face of the movement instead of her, Colvin states that she has made peace with that and is now only happy that her children and grandchildren get to sit on whatever bus seat they desire without any trouble. And I'd like to pose a question for my fellow hosts. Does this surprise you? Does this knowledge make you think differently or want to know more about what you were taught in history class in your school?
Yeah, I think that it kind of surprises me and it kind of doesn't surprise me because the older you get and the further you get into history classes, they become more and more complex. The more you realize that what you're getting is kind of a sanitized version of history. And part of that is because you can't fit an entire, you can take an entire course on the civil rights movement. You can't fit that into 2 weeks of one semester, right? But I think a lot of it is also that the US government decides what is taught in their schools. So they choose what makes it a more favorable impression on the US government, especially considering that the role the US government has had in suppressing people of color and gay people throughout their history. They kind of try and cover that up and make it seem like, especially with the civil rights movement, there is a lot done to make it seem like more of a peaceful movement than it was. In what I think is a way to try and encourage peaceful protest instead of violent protest, right? Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X. And that kind of sanitization is kind of only done for the government's benefit in trying to, prevent the spread of communism and try and keep us believing that peaceful protests are the only way progress can be made instead of one of the ways.
I also think that in the excerpt, when the author says most individuals mistake Rosa Parks for being the first woman, that does not surprise me because in my curriculum and growing up in school, I learned far more about Rosa Parks, and I may have heard about Claudette Colvin, but it definitely wasn't because of the school curriculum. I think the problem with this isn't just with the school curriculum, it also has to do with the fact that history is expansive, and we're creating history every single day, right? So to try to encapsulate the entirety of history into one school curriculum, it's a very difficult task. And also, you have to take into consideration that these are students trying to retain this information. So the government or whoever creates the curriculum, such as the districts, they focus on what they believe are the most prominent leaders. And since Rosa Parks is considered the woman, the mother of the Civil Rights Act or the Civil Rights Movement, they will obviously talk about her more. But I would even argue that Claudette Colvin obviously is far more significant because she actually initiated this boycott movement. And I also think that when we're discussing history in classes and when we're taught history in school, we should focus more on the trends rather than the prominent people. Obviously, we should discuss these types of people, but since it's so difficult to try to talk about everybody, if we discuss trends more, we could actually understand why people make the decisions that they do and why history is the way it is. And when people understand the reasoning behind history, I think that actually also stops people from listening to misinformation or just taking things at eye value, because they'll actually understand how decisions have been made over history. And if it makes sense with how life goes and how decisions are made and policies enacted and how people make decisions for who will be the leader of a civil rights movement or whatever movement is modern today.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think also the version of history, like Madi said, that we've learned has been very sanitized. And I think what a lot of people ignore that is that Rosa Parks was actually really involved in the civil rights movement even prior to sitting, like launching the bus boycotts. The way we learn about civil rights is through these like isolated incidents. Like I always, when I was a kid, imagined that sit-ins were just like spontaneous, like people just sitting down, and like starting a protest, which obviously that isn't how that works. And I think in our curriculums, the complexities of the civil rights movement have been majorly downplayed. And so like a lot of incidents like Colvin's kind of get lost in like creating this very sanitized narrative of history. But I'm really happy that people are doing the work to sort of uncover these lesser told stories and to bring them to light.
Yeah, so what's interesting is that there was actually discussion about whether or not Rosa Parks would be the face of the movement, and in a way, it was kind of not a decision made by an outside organization. It was made within the NAACP, right? So after Claudette Colvin was arrested and put into jail, they declared that they must organize a bus boycott. This is an excerpt from the essay. This is where the issue starts to arise. The rest of the committee decided on not using Colvin as the face of this movement because she had a dark complexion and was only 15. So they knew that white allies would not support their anti-segregation movement. They decided, though, to have Rosa Parks as the face of the movement, as she was a well-known and respected member of her community, and her complexion was what was associated with the middle class. The board decided that she would best fit the face to lead this movement, and that's when Rosa Parks made the move to sit in the white section of the bus, eventually getting arrested and sent to jail, and kicking off what we view as the, bus boycotts. But also, it should be noted that at that point, Colvin and Rosa Parks were friends, and they were both involved in the movement together. So do you guys agree with the decision to make Rosa Parks the face of the bus boycott movement over Claudette Colvin? And do you think that, and why do you think that skin color affected the decision to make Rosa Parks the face of the movement?
Well, I think to this decision in general, it had to do with a bunch of different types of facets, such as Colvin's age, and Rosa Parks' reputation already at the time. As Harnoor stated earlier, Rosa Parks was already involved. She already had experience with the NAACP, and Colvin was still a 15-year-old person. Imagine being 15 years old and then being the face of a movement in a time where racism and discrimination was so prominent. That would be awful, honestly, and then that could probably be traumatizing. Rosa Parks got arrested, and in the excerpt as well, the author talks about how Colvin, her family was afraid of getting attacked by the KKK, and she wasn't even the face of the movement. So imagine that just 10 times worse. Another facet of this problem also has to do with how the civil rights movement wants to make themselves out to be, and the power of persuasion. They're trying to convince people to believe in their movements, and in this time and today, colorism is very real. So since Rosa Parks was lighter skinned and Colvin was darker skinned, Rosa Parks may have garnered more attention and more respect because of that instead of Colvin. So whether their decision is right or wrong or ethical or unethical, you could use in a variety of lens. I think it was the best choice given the time period, especially for the greater good, to garner respect and then draw people into the movement itself.
Yeah, I agree. I think, like when we're talking about how organized these movements really were, it was a question of sort of like optics and how to get the most people on board and how to get the most coverage. And I think there's stuff like this that happens across the civil rights movement. So stories of how, people would put children at the front of protests so that like audiences living in white suburbia would be absolutely horrified by police attacking like very, very young children during these protests. And also like even going back to Plessy v. Ferguson, like Plessy was an eighth Black, so he looked like a white man, and that was to garner the support of white America. And so obviously like colorism is this very complex issue that I think is only really recently been started to be addressed. But I think it was just like an extension of how like thoughtfully organized these movements were, where they were just trying to get as much coverage and as many people on board as possible. And sometimes what you have to do is make a really difficult decision to sort of go along with the way that, bias makes people think. And so I think it's a really complicated issue. I don't think there was really like a right choice to be made there. There was also something to be said for, Colvin's youth and like Parks's like the amount of experience she had. But I think like what this kind of shows is like it's a testament to how well organized the civil rights movement was, and like how much work was put in for it to be effective.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think that it is important to consider that it was a very different time, right? And I mean, end of the day, buses did get desegregated, but it's also important that colorism is still very prominent, even if people, especially white people, don't really view it as a prominent part of their lives. It is a prominent part of people of color's lives from many different cultures. Thank you, imperialism and colonization. But I also think it's important to note that not only was she a dark-skinned 15-year-old, when the bus boycotts, like protesting happened, she found out she was pregnant with a child, right? She was expelled from her high school because she was pregnant. And I don't think that was the kind of image they wanted to reflect to middle-class white Americans who they were genuinely trying to persuade to join the civil rights movement, right? And the best way to do that was to paint the picture of a respectable, member of like elderly, not, she wasn't super old, but like older member of society. And I think that it makes sense, but I don't understand why to this day Claudette Colvin still isn't mentioned, since we know that she was the root of the civil rights movement. Because I just think that even if it made sense then, I think now we can have an open conversation about the dark-skinned 15-year-old who inspired the bus boycotts instead of only Rosa Parks.
And going off of Madi, of what she said about discussing this and how we might not know why they made the decision that they did to not talk about Claudette Colvin, I think a way that we can keep her story alive is by discussing this, and not just outside with our peers, but also in classrooms and discussing stories like this. I think this was a wonderful essay, wonderfully written, and it was wonderful to hear about Claudette Colvin, who is not discussed enough.
Yeah, from all of us here, thank you for watching. I hope you all learned something today about a little bit more about the civil rights movement, and one of the unsung heroes of the many people who refused to give up their seats on trolleys and trains and buses during the long history of segregation in America. Shout out Plessy V. Ferguson. What a guy. My man.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for listening.
Thanks. If you're interested in learning more about our work at Novelly, be sure to check us out at www.novelly.org. We'll see you next time on the Read to Heal podcast.